During the Second World War, there were many evil doctors and members of the concentration camp's guard force who were involved in conducting traumatic and harrowing human experimentation upon prisoners. Many people inside of the camps knew that if they were required to meet with these doctors, then they would not make it out alive. Many of these men were responsible for the slaughter and deaths of thousands of people, and some, such as the Angel of Death, Josef Mengele, would never be brought to trial for their crimes during the conflict, living out the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders. Under the Third Reich and the Nazi regime, many doctors who had before the conflict been involved in helping patients became cold-blooded killers, with Hitler's policies and laws allowing them to take lives rather than save them. But there were some who were brought to trial. This included Hitler's own escort doctor Karl Gebhardt, a man who had been close with the Führer, but he was executed inside the walls of Ravensbruck prison, an American-occupied prison, for being involved in the slaughterous programs of the Nazis. But alongside him at his trial was the personal doctor and close friend of the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler. Karl Gebhardt was once a very well-respected doctor who progressed sports medicine, and inside of Germany he was seen as one of the most skilled medical minds. But during World War II, Gebhardt became ruthless in his treatment of human subjects, and his experiments led to the deaths of many, some who were infected with deadly illnesses, just to see how they would recover. His experiments were truly sadistic, and on the 2nd of June 1948, at the age of 50, Karl Gebhardt was too led out to the execution scaffold inside of Ravensbruck prison. But what did he do inside the concentration camps that led to his death? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Karl Franz Gebhardt was born on the 23rd of November 1897 inside of Bavaria. He had a relatively normal upbringing and school life for a German boy at the time, and he then went to university to study medicine. Whilst he was there, he got involved in different political movements and was a member of the Upland Alliance, a national counter-revolutionary movement. But despite this political awakening, Gebhardt studied medicine in the city of Munich, beginning his degree in 1919. He continued to study hard, but in 1923 he was involved in an event which would change the face of Germany forever. The Munich Putsch was Hitler's failed attempt to seize control and power inside of Munich and Bavaria, to then spring the start of a revolution to bring down the whole of Germany's government. This would of course fail, and result in Hitler's arrest following a shootout with police, but during the putsch there were many pro-Nazi groups who were involved in the action, including many of the Freikorps. These were right-wing paramilitaries, mostly made up of still armed First World War German soldiers, but Gebhardt was involved with the Freikorps Oberland, and he did get involved in the Beer Hall Putsch, mostly probably based outside in the squares around Munich, waiting for the sign that the revolution was now in full swing. He then began to focus back on medicine following this for some time, and in 1924, after 2 years of unpaid work as an apprentice physician, he was given a job as an intern inside the surgical clinic at the University of Munich. He trained under some very well-respected German doctors and surgeons, and received the highest degree possible in 1932. Gebhardt's career before the Second World War was relatively successful. He particularly focused on sports medicine and the development of this, looking at how athletes following injury could recover better and have a more effective healing. He wrote many articles and books on rehabilitation regarding athletes, and his ideas became known about not just in Germany but all across Europe. Gebhardt was drawn to Nazism like millions of people were. Following the failing of the Munich Putsch and Hitler's release from prison, the political party came back with a vengeance, with millions of people flocking to join. Gebhardt joined the Nazi Party on the 1st of May 1933, becoming a fully paid-up member, and he then got involved in local activities. In 1935 he moved to Berlin, as he was appointed as an associate professor of medicine there, and while he was there in Berlin, he was recruited to join the SS, Heinrich Himmler's paramilitary group, who would later become the guards of the concentration camps. It was through his links in the SS that Gebhardt would later rise to power and move inside some very influential circles. He was then appointed as the medical superintendent of the Hohenlinchen Sanatorium. This was a recovery and medical site which had opened in 1902, and for some time tuberculosis was treated here, with patients being given fresh air, sunlight, a good diet and exercise to try and recover. The facility got much bigger, and during World War I it was a military hospital. Following the Nazi takeover of power, Gebhardt spoke with Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, who Gebhardt had actually been to school with, and he was given the power to turn Hohenlinchen into a centre for sports and rehabilitation medicine, and to act as a military hospital for the SS. The sanatorium at the time had an excellent reputation for treating tuberculosis in children, and the former medical director, a Jewish doctor, who had been in post for 19 years, was immediately sacked, with Gebhardt coming in and changing the whole outlook and the use of the facility. The site focused on sports and occupational injuries and reconstructive surgery, and it was given a huge amount of funding by the Nazis. Hohenlinchen then became a fashionable place to stay, and many high-ranking Nazis, including Heinrich Himmler, Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess, and many others would stay there to rest from the stress of their jobs. Amongst those who also visited the facility was Adolf Hitler, the dictator who was impressed with what he saw, and many other dignitaries from different nations were invited to see Gebhardt's work. There was a huge gymnasium and swimming pool created, and between 1933 and 1942 there were over 25,000 people treated at the facility. A second railway station was even built to give the site better links to Berlin. During the 1936 Berlin Summer Olympics, the hospital was used for different athletes, and Gebhardt, as senior physician, treated some of the most well-known competitors. He continued to rise throughout the medical field and world, and in 1938 he was appointed the personal physician of Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler. He would accompany his longtime friend on many visits, and he was in control of ensuring that Heinrich Himmler's health was in tip-top shape, and if he did have an issue or get ill, then Gebhardt would administer different medications. It is important to establish that unlike the doctor of Adolf Hitler, Theodor Morell, Gebhardt was not necessarily a quack. He was at the time a world-renowned physician in his field, and he was considered one of the brightest up-and-coming doctors before the war began, making many different breakthroughs in the medical field. However, during the Second World War, Karl Gebhardt was given the role of Chief Surgeon of Staff of the Reich, and he would be given directions to operate on high-ranking Nazis if the situation arose. Hohenlinchen Sanatorium would then become a military hospital for the Waffen-SS during the war, and Gebhardt remained there, and with Heinrich Himmler for many years. Soldiers who were injured and who had suffered with conditions from the battlefield were repatriated back to the sanatorium to recover and rest, with Gebhardt's crew of doctors overseeing their treatment. But there was a huge problem in 1942 for Gebhardt, and this involved the treatment of a high-ranking SS official, Reinhard Heydrich. Heydrich was the Reich's protector of Bohemia and Moravia, and he was overseeing the Czech lands that the Nazis had seized. He was known as a butcher of Prague, and his ruthless actions and treatment of the Czech people forced them into submission. Under Heydrich's command, hundreds of Czech people went missing and were executed. Many were abducted to go and work in slave labour projects, and there were regularly bodies strung up from lampposts to warn the Czech people not to get involved in resistance activity against the Nazis. Heydrich was a brute who deserved his nickname, but he was targeted for assassination, and in May 1942 he was ambushed by Czech British-trained SOE agents who attacked his car whilst it was travelling in Prague. Heydrich was not immediately killed in the bomb attack, and he had also been staggering around, trying to kill his attackers before he crumpled on the floor in a heap. In his role as a chief surgeon of the staff of the Reich, and also the personal doctor of Heinrich Himmler, Karl Gebhardt was sent to Prague to take over the treatment of Heydrich and to ensure that he got better. Himmler was very close with Heydrich, and he directed Gebhardt to ensure that he received the best care possible following the attack. Gebhardt arrived in Prague and he analysed the patient. Heydrich was suffering with a fever, but he seemed to be recovering well after he had surgery performed with his chest wound, diaphragm and left lung being debrided. It was following this that Gebhardt took over control of Heinrich's care. He did not perform the initial surgery. After consulting with other high-ranking Nazi doctors, including Hitler's personal physician Morell, who was, as mentioned, considered a quack, Morell stated that Heinrich should be treated with sulfonamide, which was an early developed antibiotic, and he claimed that this would bring down Heinrich's fever, which was not breaking. Gebhardt thought better than to use the advice of Morell, who on this occasion was probably correct, as Heinrich was suffering with some form of infection from the bomb attack, and the use of the antibiotic could have helped. Gebhardt was adamant that Heinrich would recover on his own, and he did not use sulfonamide. But days later, on the 3rd of June 1942, Heinrich fell into a coma, and he died the next day. His autopsy showed he had died from sepsis, an infection which has spread to his major organs, and this could have been prevented by Gebhardt if he had taken the advice of Morell. The death of Heinrich was seen as a major blow for the Nazis, and in particular the reputation of Karl Gebhardt suffered because of this, and many believe that his refusal to administer the drug condemned Reinhard Heydrich. But during the Second World War, Karl Gebhardt was also involved in detailed and brutal medical experimentation. Gebhardt would regularly make the trip from Hernlinchen to the nearby all-female concentration camp at Ravensbruck. He also visited Auschwitz too, where he consulted with doctors such as Mengele on different things, but at Ravensbruck he was not the most popular. Gebhardt wanted to experiment upon the women and the prisoners there, but the commandant at the time, Fritz Sören, pushed back upon this, and he knew that if the war would be lost for the Germans, then the actions of Gebhardt experimenting upon the prisoners would be a major war crime, and something he and Gebhardt could be held accountable for. But Heinrich Himmler got involved in this dispute, and he then ordered the commandant of Ravensbrück to cooperate with his doctor, and Gebhardt was then allowed to conduct the experiments. He was obsessed with the idea of rehabilitating his reputation following Heydrich's death, and he wanted to prove that prescribing sulfonamide would not have saved Heydrich. Gebhardt was advised by Himmler to experiment upon the prisoners to prove that the drug was useless in the treatment of sepsis and gangrene. He did this at Ravensbrück and carried out many horrific experiments upon the female prisoners of the site. He cut their legs and arms open with sharp instruments and then deliberately infected them with different organisms. He then administered the drug to see if it had any effect, but he did not stop there. Gebhardt went further, deliberately breaking the legs of prisoners and then infecting them, and he also tried to transplant the limbs of healthy victims of the camp, amputating them, and then trying to give them to German soldiers who had been wounded on the Eastern Front. It was claimed about his work that the operations were very brutal. Bones were broken with a hammer and chisel, wounds were sutured and plastered for only a few days, and then the plaster was removed to observe the healing processes of the wound. There were operations that were conducted without anaesthesia, and the experiments were repeated many times on the same people. For his work, many innocent people lost their lives and limbs, and the women subjected to this treatment received little to no nursing care, and many died because of Gebhardt's experiments. In 1944, Karl Gebhardt, despite the damage to his reputation, was sent to treat Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and architect, for fatigue and for a swollen knee. But something did go very wrong during this, and he almost killed Speer, who became very sick, and Gebhardt was replaced. Because of his close relationship with Heinrich Himmler, Gebhardt rose to some very senior positions in the SS, eventually becoming a general lieutenant. But in the final days of World War II, he was inside of Berlin, as the Soviet Red Army approached and rained down chaos on the city. Hitler would, on the 30th of April 1945, shoot himself inside of his bunker, but Karl Gebhardt, who had assumed leadership of the German Red Cross, then approached the German Chancellor, Joseph Goebbels, after Hitler's death, about getting the Goebbels children out of Berlin, smuggling them past enemy lines to get them to safety. This act would have saved the children, but Goebbels chose to ignore Gebhardt, and his 6 children were all killed inside of the bunker hours later. At the end of the war, Gebhardt, having escaped Berlin, was arrested by American forces. He had fled the Soviets and hoped he would receive lighter punishment at the hands of the US Army. But there was a distinct need to punish those war criminals who had conducted horrific actions during the conflict, and this included searching for the doctors of the concentration camps, and also those remaining high-ranking Nazis. Let's remember that Karl Gebhardt, despite his work in the camps, was Heinrich Himmler's personal doctor, and he had accompanied Himmler in his attempt to break out to freedom, but Gebhardt was brought to trial in what was known as the Doctor's Trial. This was the first of 12 trials for war crimes against German officials that the US authorities held in Nuremberg. There were 23 defendants who were medical doctors and nurses, and they were accused of human experimentation and mass murder linked to the Action T4 program. It was said of the crimes of the defendants that the defendants in this case are charged with murders, tortures, and other atrocities committed in the name of medical science. The victims of these crimes are numbered in their hundreds of thousands. A handful only are still alive. A few of the survivors will appear in this courtroom, but most of the miserable victims were slaughtered outright or died in the course of the torture that they were subjected to. For the most part, they are the nameless dead. To their murderers, these wretched people were not individuals at all. They came in wholesale lots and were treated worse than animals. The defendants were all charged with 4 crimes: conspiracy to commit war crimes and crimes against humanity, war crimes including medical experimentation without consent, and murder and torture, crimes against humanity, and membership of a criminal organisation as in the SS. Karl Gebhardt was accused of all 4 charges, but he was acquitted of the first charge. He testified at the trial about his actions and tried to defend himself, but it was quickly established that Karl Gebhardt was an unrepentant Nazi and that he had absolutely no remorse for his actions. Alongside him, 2 of his assistants were convicted for their crimes, with Herta Oelberhäuser, the only female defendant of the Doctor's Trial, being sentenced to 20 years in prison. But Karl Gebhardt was given the death penalty, and he was then sent to Landsberg prison to await his execution. He had been sentenced to death on the 20th of April 1947, and he did appeal this, and tried his best to avoid the hangman's noose. Despite pleas for clemency, Gebhardt's death sentence was confirmed, and he was then, on the 2nd of June 1948, informed that his death sentence and execution would be carried out in a few hours. He was given some time to get his affairs in order, and then a number of American military policemen arrived at his cell and informed him that the execution was now to go ahead. Also executed on the same day as Karl Gebhardt was Karl Brandt, Hitler's doctor, Rudolf Brandt, the administrative officer to Himmler, Joachim Rogogowski, a senior doctor, Wolfram Sievers, a director at the Institute for Military Scientific Research, Victor Brack, a chief administrative officer in the Chancellery of the Führer, and Waldemar Herven, the chief doctor of Buchenwald Concentration Camp. Karl Gebhardt was led from his prison cell out to the courtyard of the prison, and here there were 2 gallows constructed within the US-occupied prison, and he was flanked by many military policemen who were there to ensure he went to his death calmly. Also by Gebhardt's side was a priest who was there to administer spiritual counsel in his final moments, and he would also record the doctor's final words. Karl Gebhardt had his identity confirmed at the bottom of the gallows, and he was then helped up the 13 steps of the execution scaffold by prison officials, and they remained on the scaffold as he was handed over to the American executioner. He took possession of Gebhardt and ensured that his legs were secured and tied tightly, and also that his arms were secured behind his back. This was done to prevent him flailing and kicking as he plunged through the trapdoor. Gebhardt then uttered his final words, which were unrepentant, and he claimed, "I die without bitterness, but regret that there is still some injustice in the world." The executioner then shuffled Karl Gebhardt over the trapdoor, and he allowed for a final photograph to be taken of him. He was being held tightly by prison officials, and was wearing the prison uniform, and a belt wrapped tightly around his waist to prevent his trousers falling down during the execution. Gebhardt then had a black cap placed over his head, and the executioner took the noose in his hand and secured it tightly and firmly around the neck of the former SS doctor. The executioner then quickly pushed the lever of the trapdoor, opening it, and Karl Gebhardt plunged through the gallows structure, and he was one of the first to be executed that day. His remains were left on the rope, concealed behind the scaffold for some time, before a US doctor examined them, and his remains were then packed away inside of a coffin. There is some debate as to what happened to his body, but it is believed that his family claimed his remains and then had him buried inside the Ostfriedhof in Munich, and there is a gravestone that carries the name of Karl Gebhardt. He was a ruthless and brutal SS doctor who conducted scores of atrocities and war crimes. Karl Gebhardt rose to the position of Heinrich Himmler's chief doctor and physician, and he would during World War II get involved in the harrowing experimentation upon prisoners of the concentration camps. Before the war, his reputation was fledgling, and he was seen as one of the leaders in treatment of sports injuries, but inside of the Third Reich, Gebhardt became a butcher and a beast who conducted terrible crimes. His execution inside of Landsberg prison that day was one of a number of doctors and men who had been condemned during the same court proceedings as him, and Karl Gebhardt went to his death unrepentant for his crimes, and he did not care for the victims of his actions. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.